will start recording now so that it'll be available later. Um, if anybody has any access needs, feel free to message me privately. I unfortunately haven't figured out how to get a transcription going yet, but I would be happy to provide a transcript later if anybody is deaf or hard of hearing or wants a transcript for any reason. I can type it up if somebody wants that. So just let me know. Chloe, can you think of anything else before I get started? I think you're muted.
Yeah, I think that covers most things. Closed captions should be enabled.
Okay. I'm not seeing them, but
I could. Yeah, if anyone needs it, message privately me or Hannah. I can, I think as co-hosts, it's under more at the bottom, and it says closed caption. We can like assign it to a participant.
cool. Yeah, if you can just message Chloe privately, I'm having a little trouble figuring that out, so apologies. Hi, everybody. It's nice to meet you. Chloe, have people been going around and doing like introductions or just kind of launching into things?
It's up to you. I think with like a small group like we have, I think it might be nice to go around and maybe share like why we're interested and our pronouns and where we're from. But totally up to you and whatever time you have allotted.
Yeah, I'm not worried about it. Hi, I'm Hannah Kagan-Moore. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in the history of art and architecture at UCSB. My work deals with the early modern world, so approximately 1400 to 1700, 1750, but those are loose dates and they are arbitrary and have a lot more to do with later academics than history itself. My interests are in early modern labor movements, early modern identity, early modern civic projects, and early modern urban space. And use she, her, or they, them is fine. Probably she, her today. And I'm really excited to be doing this. And I apologize if I'm a little bit out of it. I'm on like day 3 of the tail end of a migraine. So I am a little maybe lower energy than I normally would be. Chloe, do you want to go next? Just name and pronouns, interests.
Yeah, I'm Chloe Gentile. I use she, her pronouns. Yeah, and I am the UCSB point person for Strike You. So if anyone has any questions or wants to provide any feedback afterward, feel free to come to me. And if you have any access needs throughout, message me personally and I can try to figure that out as we go. Yeah, and I am in the musicology department at UCSB. And whoever wants to go next can go.
I can go next. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool, great. My name's Rowan. I'm a second year PhD student at UCSC. I thank you so much for putting this on. I'm really excited. And I guess part of my interest is there's a portion of my work that deals with early modern history, so like enclosures in Britain and sort of resistance movements like the diggers and the levellers. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this a lot. Thanks very much.
Like a bit more basic for you, but
I will hand it off to Matt if we want to do it that way. Cool.
Yeah. All right. Hi, my name is Max. I use they, them pronouns. I'm based in Santa Cruz. I am a UCSC dropout because it got too expensive. So I definitely have been really involved, really interested in the COLA movement, especially at UCSC. It's very large, and now I'm organizing around a rent strike in Santa Cruz. I'm associated with Operation White Flag, which our niche is labor history. And so I'm really excited to engage with the content today.
Awesome.
Yeah. I'll pass it to Sylvia.
Hi, I'm Sylvia. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently in Nebraska, but I have a background. I've worked in higher ed in California. Currently learning more and getting involved in the K-12 Omaha Public Schools Teachers Union and some of the current issues there. So I'm excited to learn kind of more about the history of everything. And I'll pass it to Shannon.
Shannon, are you there?
Hi, this is Shannon. I'm a sorry, I just woke up. Sorry, I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at Berkeley. I study historical sociology and late modern labor movements in Europe. And I have been active in the dissident wing of the labor movement since I got here for many years in AUDU, Academic Workers of Democratic Union, and yeah, so it's great. Thanks for doing this.
You're welcome. It's good to hear from you. Do you want to pass this to Cole next? Are you there?
Hi. Hi, my name is Cole. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a master's student at Indiana University. I did my undergraduate at UCSC, so it's good to see some friendly faces. I'm sort of interested, I'm trying to work on a project that engages with the pamphlet as a sort of media device for political agitation in the United States, especially how it was utilized by CLR James and the Correspondence Publishing Committee in the middle of the 20th century, especially in Detroit. And I don't know, this just seemed like a really fascinating discussion, so I really wanted to hop in and have a listen.
Awesome. And Bristol?
Hi, this is Bristol. I am a history PhD at Santa Cruz. And yeah, I do like 19th and 20th century immigration and prostitution law, so very different than this, but labor history is just like my fun hobby history. So I'm excited to learn about something that's like several centuries and a different continent than I normally am on. So
Really?
yeah, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, you're so welcome. So the way I have this structured is as a talk. Tragically, there are fewer pictures than normal because I haven't had as much time to do prep as I would have liked. So usually things are pictures heavy, but I'll try to pull up a couple of things on just like Google quickly. But I'm gonna tell you all a little bit about kind of three different episodes of early modern labor history. There's an episode in 1381, an episode in 1524, and then the Enclosure Acts of the 19th century. And we're going to move around a little bit from England to Germany and back to England. It's worth noting that this is a pretty white history. Which obviously has a lot of problematics. There's no reason to believe that there were not people of color involved in this because people of color have largely been erased from European history, so that's a silence we should note. And there are a lot of cool scholars who are working on bringing those histories back. To the best of my knowledge, they haven't worked on these particular instances of labor, but I think there are still valuable things that we can get out of these histories and valuable lessons that we can learn. It's also, I think, worth noting that a lot of the episodes I'm about to talk about have also been co-opted by right-wing populist movements. And that has its own problematics. And in some ways, I'm still figuring out how I deal with that because some of the slogans that we talk about, some of the historical episodes have both been sort of claimed by later right and left historians as like, this is an example of workers rising up and coming together, or this is an example of rising up against unjust elites in a kind of populist way that's less, I would say, in line with probably the values of the people in this room. So all things to keep in the back of your brain. But I want to start by setting the scene in the 1380s in England. and we're going to talk about a revolt that's sometimes called the Peasants Revolt. It's sometimes called Wat Tyler's Revolt. He was a guy who was involved. And there's a guy named John Ball who's also involved. And what's going on in the 1380s in what is now known as Britain is that the Black Death has come in and halved the population. So that's one of the most major economic factors in the landscape, is that this plague has wiped out probably half of the workforce. And the social structure that we're talking about right now, hey Greg, would you mind just closing the door? Sure. I'm just on a call, sorry. The social structure that we're talking about in political structure is serfdom. So you've got, for those who aren't familiar, and I realize I'm talking to people at all levels of familiarity, so apologies if I'm explaining something you already know. But you've got kings, lords, the nobility, and a non-trivial gap between them and the people who are sustaining their lifestyle through feudalism. In the case of early modern Britain, it's serfdom, right? And the system of serfdom was sometimes closer to enslavement, but more commonly was a kind of indentured servitude. So poor agricultural workers would farm the land owned by the lord and produce labor and, you know, the products of their labor for the lord's benefit, and were allowed to do some subsistence farming on land they did not own in order to sustain themselves. So these people are farming sometimes 12 or 16 hours a day for somebody else. On top of that, finding time for themselves or their families to farm in order to feed themselves. They're also generally paying taxes to the manorial household. And on top of that, serfdom came with a lot of other personal restrictions, like you weren't free to marry anyone without the lord's consent. You didn't have a lot of bodily autonomy or rights. Sexual assault was prevalent and hugely problematic, both among people of your own working class, but also from the top down. So this was not a great labor system, as you can tell. And serfs eventually got fed up with it and said, screw this, we're gonna stage a revolt. And the things that their demands included an end to increasingly heightened taxation, which in the late 14th century in England, England was at war with France, and so they keep ramping the taxes up in order to pay for this war. So some of these objections are going to resonate with us, right? Protesting the use of taxation to continue funding wars. Protesting the use of taxation to line the coffers of the then Catholic Church, right? Which is an objection we'll see again in Germany some centuries later. They want an end to the system of serfdom. They want to be able to own land. They don't want to be giving the major portion of their labor toward feeding and sustaining this extremely lavish manorial system. And what happens is that this starts out as a relatively small movement and rapidly mushrooms. So by the end of these small groups of workers in various places across Britain saying, we've had enough of this and we're going to rise up. First, it starts with people taking small castles and small jails. And one of the things that they're repeatedly doing is opening up all the jails and freeing everybody who's incarcerated. This eventually they get to the major prison in London and the Tower of London. and they open up the Tower of London and say all of these, and the Tower of London, keep in mind, was for long-term incarceration. This is long-term isolation and incarceration, in some cases torture, although that is more apocryphalized, that a lot of stories get told about the horrors of the Tower of London, but it was an institutional prison. And they're opening up all the doors and start, beheading major religious figures, the wealthy lords, and eventually this is, by 1382, the rebellion is put down and around 1,500 people are executed. But one of the lasting effects was that lords at the more local levels became very cautious about the prospect of another revolt, and it's something that renters would bring up when renegotiating their rents with the lords, who are, incidentally, this is the sort of oldest set of roots of our current system of landlording. So that's why they're called landlords, is because it comes from this feudal system. And they would bring this up and say, well, we had all these revolts, maybe you should lower our rents. And I know a little bit less about how well those individual negotiations went, because my area of specialty is actually Germany. But I think one of the powerful things that we see connected here is a connection between demanding the fruits of your labor, demanding that you not be rent burdened, and demanding to let people out of jail, which are all really intertwined movements for us right now and that feel really present. And one reason that this happened was disease, and was the spread of plague that totally decimated this workforce and destabilized this system, such that John Ball and Wat Tyler and these other leaders managed to gain a platform. Now, something that's worth noting, John Ball was a priest. Wat Tyler, people disagree about what Tyler's background was. He gets painted as this sort of laborer and hero of the working people, and that's not necessarily super accurate. But it's worth keeping in mind that these people get lionized sort of as the vanguard. And obviously that's in a historical term, because the idea of vanguardism is much later. But we tend to take them as the people who were at the forefront of this movement and speaking for this movement. And I think that's historically risky, and something we can learn from, is that even the people who are the leaders who say the famous things, and John Ball's famous line when he's addressing these groups of protesters and revolutionaries is, when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? And the implication of that line is that this is a really big deal thing for them to be saying in the 14th century. So the church and religion were a major part of the fabric of everyday life. So keeping that in mind, what he's saying is, none of these kings and queens and lords and ladies have the God-given right to have more than you, to let your land, to keep you in serfdom, right? Because when Adam delved and Eve span, like when the world was created as per this Western Christian framework, nobody was a lord or a lady. Nobody had a right to that. And this troubles the basic philosophical framework that underpinned the monarchy, which is that there was a divine right, that kings, that lords, that the ruling classes were divinely appointed. And one of the reasons this line was so powerful is that it basically called shenanigans on that concept. So, and whether or not John Ball actually said this is to some degree up for debate. But the result we get is a largely working class movement that wanted to let everybody out of jail and cancel rent. So that's pretty cool. And they made it all the way to the Tower of London and beheaded a bunch of people, which is complicated. But this line gets taken up in Germany about 150 years later. And in 1524 and 25, German peasants, German agricultural workers, are experiencing something similar, which is that they are overtaxed. A lot of those taxes are going to the Catholic Church. And the one thing that people are upset about is religious freedom, that they don't get to choose their own preachers, but often this gets framed as a purely religious concern, and it's also deeply economic, because in choosing their own preachers, they were choosing people who had to be paid less and were not pouring a lot of money into large artistic projects, elaborate outfits, stuff like that. We're seeing people just at the beginning of the Protestant Reformation who are interested in taking religion in a different direction. And at this point in history, we don't have separate camps of like the Catholics versus the Protestants, because it's still kind of in the works. But basically what you have are a bunch of somewhat radical rebel Catholic priests who are saying, no, this institution is super corrupt. And in throughout southern Germany, what we call Bavaria, there's a movement that eventually leads to what's called the German Peasants' War, and they take up this line from John Ball in German as "Wann Adam grubt und Eva span, wo war denn da der Edelmann?" So, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? And John Ball's phrase gets continuity. The German Peasants' War is even bigger, but gets put down in an even bloodier manner. Unfortunately, this is the kind of grisly ending of a lot of this early modern labor history. Some estimates are that about 150,000 people died, but what they were campaigning for and what they wanted was encapsulated in what are called the 12 article, the 12 articles, or the 12 articles of Memmingen, which is a place in Germany. And a lot of the things in those 12 articles were labor issues that we're still fighting for today. They had to do with lower rents. They had to do with having common spaces, the commons, as they're known if you're familiar with England, early modern England. The commons were spaces where you could, among other things, primarily hunt, and where you could also raise livestock or even garden. But it was a common area, common to the people, where the ability to raise your animals, to graze your animals, and to practice other agriculture was generally available, because during the early modern period, generally speaking, the woods were the king's land, or the land of the reigning monarch. So you, unless you had permission, you weren't allowed to hunt, you weren't allowed to gather firewood. You can see that if you were a poor working class agricultural worker during this period and you can't gather firewood without your lord's permission, or can't herd your geese around and find places for them to eat food, you're going to have a problem. And frequently this led both to a lot of hunger and widespread famine issues, and also a lot of really, really nasty corporal punishment for people who gathered wood without permission or were considered to be trespassing. And so one of the things that these German agricultural workers are asking for is a return to the commons and greater rights for hunting and gathering wood in the forests. They're asking for rent reductions, and they're asking for taxation reductions. So again, it has to do with fewer burdens toward an entity that you're already paying toward, which feels resonant, I think, for those of us who are part of COLA and part of Strike U, between fees and tuition and all of these other amounts that we pay toward the university, on top of which we labor for the university. You know, in Germany, we're talking about the Holy Roman Empire and local lords and local ruling systems, but a lot of the complaints are the same. And finally, I want to talk a little bit, how are we doing on time? Cool, perfect. This leads us into the later early modern, the close of the early modern and the beginning of kind of the modern period. And I want to return to England just for a minute to talk about something that somebody, I think it was Rowan, mentioned earlier, the Enclosure Acts. And the Enclosure Acts took those commons that I was talking about and basically took them away. And there's a really famous, I think also it's a labor song. I think it's been set to music. I'm familiar with it as a poem, but I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it has been set to music as well. Rowan, did you want to contribute something to that? I think you're muted.
Oh yeah, I just was smiling because I wondered if it was going to be about the geese. And
It's the geese. It's absolutely the geese. So there's a song called, I believe it's called "The Goose and the Commons," or a poem, and it goes, "The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common." So you get locked up if you steal the goose off the common, but leaves the greater villain loose who steals the common off the goose. And the greater villain is the reigning lord who owns the common, which is itself being characterized as a kind of theft, right? It is theft of common land. And the lines in the song continue that, oh, let's see if I can remember this. That the law says that we must atone for taking things we do not own, but leaves the lords and ladies fine, who take things that are yours and mine. And it ends with that geese will still a common lack until they go and steal it back. And so we're both being associated with the geese and personified with the geese as the common worker, but the implication is very clear that the common belongs to the people, and the theft of the common is a theft on the part of the ruling class. And unfortunately, the thing that happened with the Enclosure Acts when these common areas were stripped away from the working classes is that many people who were previously living an agricultural subsistence farming life, relying partly on that grazing land and on that farmland to survive, were instead forced into urban areas and forced into urban employment, thus fueling the Industrial Revolution. So capital had a direct interest in enforcing acts like these because they forced large populations of starving, desperate workers into cities. So that's the somewhat grim early modern labor history I have for you today. I was thinking also that if we just want to turn the second half of this into kind of a discussion and roundtable, thinking about what we get out of this, if people have other questions about this history that I can answer, but thinking about the utility of these early modern histories, what we can learn from these long dead movements for ourselves. So I'll open it up. I can take stack if that becomes an issue. And I guess I would prompt it by saying, what do we get out of this? What are either the associations that you notice, things that resonate with you from this history, problems you have with it, etc.?
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
I'm curious if you could say more about, like, it sounds like these were pretty big movements of a lot of people, and I'm wondering, like, how they were communicating with each other, how, like, were people hearing about this happening and just, like, ready to go and, like, fuck yeah, I'm gonna join this? Or, like, was there some kind of conscious, like, organizing going on?
So this is a great and really difficult question to answer, unfortunately. One of the problems with this is that a lot of the records we have are printed records, but we're talking about a population of people who are predominantly illiterate. Literacy rates were really low during this period. And so we have to assume that the people who were writing the pamphlets, or who we have quotations from because their words were written down, like John Ball, like the 12 Articles of Memmingen, who were written by a guy named Christopher, and oh, I'm gonna forget his last name. But written by these guys who are these sort of radical priests, generally speaking, are the demagogues and the people who are sort of whipping people into a frenzy and becoming movement figureheads. The problem is that we don't have a record of any other organizing that was happening underneath them. The records that we get are of the guys who were literate, the guys who were then giving speeches that were reprinted and republished. So this means that we have a lot of silences in terms of the actual workers who were putting themselves on the line. And indeed, we definitely have a record that they were. So we know somebody was talking to somebody. My guess, if I had to guess, if you held me to the wall and made me guess, is both that to some degree people were ready to go because they were super fed up. To a large degree, this was a very different landscape of communication than the one we have. We think about, it's hard to get several thousand people together to talk to one another, but these were really small communities. You knew everybody in your community really intimately because in your immediate community, there might have been 100 or 200 people. And so I think the question is less how this spread internally within a community, because I think pretty clearly that is solidaristic relationship first, mutual aid organizing, versus how it spread from town to town, from shareholding to shareholding, etc. And in that moment, I think these sort of vanguard-like religious figures are the key. That these guys brought these movements out of their immediate bubbles and were going to the next town or to the next manorial holding and saying, listen, everybody over here is rising up. You gonna do it? So to some degree, was this just that you push people to their limit and they snap and have enough? Sure. I mean, that's why we're all here, right? Is that everybody finally said, fuck this shit, I hate it. This is not a way to live, right? And we're gonna do something about it. But I think there is a relationship that on the one hand is a little different from ours because we are not connected with one another in our communities in the same way that early modern people were connected. We have a larger global web of connection because we have the internet, and I'm talking to all of you in Indiana and all over California and everywhere else, which is very exciting. But at the same time, one thing that I think our movement really stands to benefit from is the kind of relationship first organizing that characterized the early modern world, in which long-standing social relationships were the foundation for having one another's backs, right? And that I think one of the things that our movements are missing in some ways is, rather than going out and having quote unquote organizing conversations where somebody says, hey, I'm from this organization, have you heard about us? Do you want to join us? Which mostly tends at least to make me feel like someone's trying to sell me a vacuum. That starting by saying, hey, it's nice to meet you, you're my neighbor or you're in my neighborhood. How's it going? What's going on in your life? What are the issues affecting you? Oh, you can't pay your rent? I can't pay my rent either. And leading with actual genuine relational care instead of this sort of organizing pitch that I think we've all learned is how you do that. That's a really meandering answer. Does that address that question?
Yeah, no, that really does. And it's interesting. I'm thinking about like my efforts to like kind of organize the people around me, like organize within my department. And the other thing I'm thinking about that might be kind of a difference is the degree to which a lot of people that are like resistant to joining this movement are people that like don't seem to believe that collective action works, which I think is something that like a lot of historians are like weirdly kind of conservative about, because like they're always just looking for like how things fall apart and how things fail. And so they're like, I'm not going to be a part of a movement because it's going to fail. But also like this attachment to kind of like an individualized, like, you know, yeah, things suck for me, but like they're not always going to suck. There are ways that I can work out of this. And so it's interesting to think about a group of people for whom like that like individual mobility was maybe not so resonant, and maybe, you know, people were able to collectivize what's going on for them in a different way. So that's interesting to think about.
And I think the thing you say about historians here is really resonant for me, which is partly that often I think we get hung up on all the bad stuff because we see it all and we see the complexity and the failures and the mess of all of this and the way that polemics and propaganda get used to push agendas, that we're so bound up in the complexity of the thing that sometimes the human elements of it fall away.
Yeah,
and that
definitely.
It's hard to feel these serfs in 1381 going like the practical lived reality of, okay, well, shit, we're all sick of farming 12 hours a day in the summer and then coming home and having to make sure that we are doing our own subsistence. And meanwhile, you're raising taxes on what we already don't have. And I think it's hard to feel the resonance of that with your own situation when you've got a bunch of bills and an empty bank account and the numbers don't add up no matter how much math you try to do. I think remembering that this has a really long trajectory is one of the things that keeps me going. That this is a struggle with a massive historical narrative arc.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll jump in and just off the back of both of those comments, I think, yeah, that's really illuminating and super helpful to think about the types of solidarity perhaps that are possible when you have X amount of people under a shared landlord. And I really appreciate your point, Bristol, about the question of failure of social history and social movements that I think maybe gets lost. And Hannah, I think you kind of pointed to this as like, if our archival sources are ones in which punishment and the quelling of resistance is always the thing that's recorded, we lose the ability to register all of the mutual aid that would have been taking place necessarily at the time. We just know that that's a fact. And I think that helps us reframe the question of failure per se, because if you think about the strike that's been going on within the UC since September, all of the mutual aid and all of the networks that have been built are not going to go away, even if the strike, quote unquote, fails, whatever that means or looks like. So I think that there's a question of how we understand power and thinking about both building power and taking power as like the two modes of resistance. And it's always the building power that isn't recorded because it's just like somebody bringing someone a meal or somebody being like, hey, I'll help you out with your rent. That doesn't look necessarily like a resistance because it's not a strike or whatever it is. So yeah, I think that there's something really, really interesting there. And maybe I have a question, Hannah, that is like, I think something that's come up a lot, and maybe Max, you could speak to this a little bit more as well, is in Santa Cruz, thinking about rent strike or something like this is really different than in a city like London, where I'm from, or even in the Bay, where there are these like huge shared landlords, and that's not really happening in the same way here. It's just a lot of like single landlords that have like 5 tenants, and then your neighbors. So this idea of like mutual oppression that would be like the base for which that sort of solidarity might come, either from a lord or from the UC as your boss and your landlord and so on, is like, it's a lot more fragmented.
Exactly.
I wonder if maybe if there's like examples historically of that, like cross solidarity that you can think of, that it might be interesting to think about, and also like how how we're sort of in this kind of time that is particularly atomized and even more atomized now, like how we can think about those things. I know you kind of spoke to it, but I wonder if there's like historical resonances there.
Yeah, this is the question, isn't it? This is the tricky bit, right? I don't have a really facile, easy answer for it. And I think one of the uncomfortable answers is that it's going to involve, and well, this is probably more comfortable for other people. It's not very comfortable for me. I'm not super good at talking to people, especially not outside of a context like this, where I'm giving a talk and responding, right? Everyday normal conversations are not really my jam, but having those kinds of conversations with neighbors and community members who we don't have a lot in common with, who are very different from us in age or political experience or race or gendered experience, a family structure, all of this stuff. I mean, I think about the fact that like I have tried to build some bridges with my immediate next door neighbors, but that's going really slowly. They are very conservative Catholics, and I am like a queer polyamorous anarchist Jew. So it's making those social connections can be really tricky. And I don't have an easy answer for it, but I think we've got to keep trying. And I think, as you say, gestures like just like bringing somebody food, checking in. I checked in to see if they needed me to like sew them some masks, because I've been sewing masks during this pandemic. Stuff like that is actually, I think, the relationship block core that we need to be doing. Even just going over and being like, yo, can I borrow a cup of sugar? Like, I'm making something, I'll bring you some banana bread or something like that. You know what I mean? I think those are actually the ways that we're going to start building the relationships where you can then have an organizing conversation where the reverse isn't true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's, yeah, and I think it has to be immediate physical community, which I realize is further complicated by the whole social distancing thing and like the fact that a lot of us are immunocompromised or have relatives or friends who are immunocompromised, the people in our community who we're trying to connect with maybe, but it's also a moment where I think we can maybe merge some of this technology that keeps us more widely connected with this idea of building closer community networks by reaching out online and being like, hey, are there people who need me? I mean, even I almost wonder about co-opting something that's normally like a shitty surveillance technology like Nextdoor, if people have heard of that, which is usually sort of a platform where the I'd like to speak to a managers of the world surveil their neighbors, but you could totally throw up a post that's like, hey, is there anybody in this community who's like lonely and would like a remote drop off of like some groceries or wants to do like a remote like knitting circle or something that helps build those bridges, and then finding the connections. It's not a perfect answer, but it's an answer. Other thoughts from people? Rowan.
Yeah, I think just like the topic of genuine community outreach is super important, especially when I think about phone banking. With like my experience with phone banking, you can't just be like, oh, like, what's your situation? Are you ready to strike? Like, the word strike just like throws people off, like, first. And second, it's like people are struggling, and like, again, it's pushing your agenda and being like, join our strike, like, this is what's best for you. But like, definitely first getting into the movement, I realized like how important mutual aid actually is, and that like that has to be the priority, because especially with like just the timeline of the shelter in place and it like being instated in like mid-March, like there wasn't time to organize. Like there just had to be harm reduction like immediately. And it's definitely I live in an apartment complex. It's pretty small. It's 17 units, and definitely like it's hard because I know like our capability to be able to like fight against our landlord and have this like long-term goal. But unfortunately, as like a young adult who lives amongst a very wide population of people, like, you know, like that sort of outreach when it's a very isolated community like that is just like alarming to people. And so it really does take time. And like you were saying, like that sort of persistence to be like, I'm a community member, and like that doesn't just mean that we live next to each other. Like how can I help you? I'm here for you. I realized like I've like distributed 2 different notes, and just like talking about a community support group and like asking what people needed, I got a lot more responses than when I was just like, contact me, like let's talk more about like how like what's your situation, like I'm worried about my community. And so yeah, definitely that propaganda with organizing and like pushing your own agenda sometimes has to be like put aside in the sake of like remembering like how much humanity there is in this struggle and how like real and material this is.
Max, I think that's beautifully put. And I think also building these longer term, deeper relationships that we can then organize around, but that are whose first goal is to know our communities and to be well connected with our communities, reaps so many different benefits, right? It cuts down on policing because we know who's around us, so people are less likely to reach for the phone and are instead likelier to go over and be like, did you hear that noise? Or whatever, right? It means that we're better supported when we need something because it's, I mean, it's about our needs too. And I think it means that when shit hits the fan, that things are less reactionary, because there is something that feels really reactionary to me about constantly being like, okay, now there's a push, let's all phone bank. Okay, now let's rise up for this. And then we have a tendency to lapse back into the sort of normalcy of our lives, whatever that looks like. And the result is that relationships created under those conditions aren't always sustainable, whereas the relationships that we create and maintain on their own terms then are places that we can come together when the going gets rough. I don't know if anybody has anything else to add. I really appreciate this conversation and getting to engage some of this kind of what usually just feels like dry, long dead European history as a launching point for thinking about how these struggles continue. And yeah, the goose is going to get its commons back. So,
oh, sorry, I was just,
please.
Unless we want to wrap up, I was just going to add one more thing. I think just going off what you said there, Max, which I think is really, is really beautifully put and really important. Maybe the importance as well of like building infrastructure, because we are also transient in a way that like in all of the examples actually that you spoke to, Hannah, people were not moving in the same way, especially not people of like that might want to join resistance movements were like not moving around necessarily in the same way. And speaking from myself, I haven't lived in the same place for more than 7 years. It's like the longest that I've ever lived anywhere. So being able to build in a way that like leaves, that is open-ended and someone else can pick something up from, I think is a really, really useful way to be thinking. And I think infrastructure is like one really great way. And we have all these tools, like you said, that are maybe not designed for us, but that we can like piggyback on and put to work. I think just as a really nice example of something that isn't necessarily local but is an act of solidarity that I think gets brought up in the Wildcat Strike is one of our meetings that was like a very, very like high energy meeting that yeah, everyone that was organizing it was like super stressed. Some auto workers from I think Michigan, but Bristol, you might want to chime in, sent a whole load of pizzas, and like everyone was just like, oh my god, free pizza, like so not it was. And that was like, you know, a few $100s, but meant that everyone in that room could eat, and it was from people that we'd never met. So there are like those modes that aren't just like necessarily local, but that like recognize some sort of shared struggle that are also really great and really beautiful, and pizza.
Yeah, exactly. Shared struggle and pizza. Start with pizza. Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining me for this. I hope that it was useful and interesting. It was really wonderful to meet all of you, and I look forward to more Strike You shenanigans and making good trouble.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Appreciate you.
Gonna stop the recording.
You.
Thank you, Hannah.